In Romania, his face is carved onto public monuments. In the English-speaking world, his name sells horror novels. Vlad the Third was a real 15th-century prince of Wallachia. In his homeland, he is a national hero who defended his people. In the West, he is a vampire. Both legends are built on the same real man. And the real man was more frightening than the fiction. The truth about Vlad the Third is not the vampire. The vampire is the comfortable version, a story invented 400 years after his death. What the real prince actually did needs no invention at all. It only needs to be told plainly, and told plainly it is worse. His name was Vlad, and he was born around 1431. His father was a Wallachian nobleman, Vlad the Second. The father belonged to a sworn brotherhood of knights called the Order of the Dragon, pledged to defend Christian Europe against the Ottoman Empire. In the language of the region, the word for dragon was Dracula, so the father became known as Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Dragon, and his son became Dracula. It did not mean monster. It meant son of the dragon. When Vlad was still a boy, his father made a bargain with the Ottoman Empire. To prove his loyalty to the Sultan, he handed over 2 of his own sons. Vlad and his younger brother Radu were taken deep into Ottoman territory and held as hostages. They were not starved or chained. They were housed, educated, and trained. But every day, the 2 boys understood one simple fact. If their father broke his word, they would be the ones to die for it. Vlad spent years of his childhood as a living guarantee, a promise that could be killed the moment his father became inconvenient. No historian can interview a child from the 15th century, but the years that followed show clearly what those years produced. Vlad came back from the Ottoman court with 3 things: a complete inability to trust, a fluent understanding of his enemy, and an absolute conviction that fear was the most reliable tool a ruler would ever hold. While Vlad was a hostage, his homeland tore itself apart. His father was murdered by rival nobles. His older brother was blinded with hot iron and buried while still alive. Wallachia did not have a stable throne. It had a chair that its own noble families, the boyars, treated as something temporary, to be sold to whoever paid the most. In 1456, Vlad took that throne. He had watched these men destroy his family. He did not intend to rule the way his father had ruled. One of his first acts as prince became one of the most repeated stories ever told about him. He invited the boyars, the noble families, he blamed for the chaos, to a feast at Easter. The older men, the ones who had betrayed his father, he simply had killed. The rest, still in their feast clothing, he marched into the mountains and worked until that fine clothing rotted off their backs, rebuilding a ruined fortress. Vlad was not interested in winning the loyalty of the old nobility. He was interested in replacing it. His chosen punishment gave him the name that history finally settled on. Impalement is a method of execution designed to do more than kill. It is designed to be seen. A body raised high on a stake stays visible from a great distance, and for a long time. Vlad used it constantly and deliberately, against criminals, against enemies, against the dishonest and the disloyal alike. Travelers described his capital ringed with the dead. He was building something out of those bodies. He was building a reputation, and that reputation did something its owner may never have fully intended. It began to travel. It crossed borders and rivers. In time, it would reach the printing presses of distant cities. But that comes later in the story. First, the reputation had to survive a test. The largest army in Europe was marching directly toward Wallachia to erase him from it. By 1462, the Ottoman Empire stood at the height of its power. Its ruler was Mehmed the Second. 9 years earlier, this same man had taken Constantinople and ended the 1,000-year Roman Empire. Mehmed had grown up in the same court where Vlad was once held hostage. The 2 men knew each other. When Vlad refused the Ottoman tribute and impaled the envoys sent to collect it, Mehmed gathered an army to remove him. Contemporary estimates place it between 100,000 and 150,000 men, one of the largest forces the Ottomans had ever brought into Europe. Vlad could not meet that army in open battle. The entire population of Wallachia was only a fraction of the force now marching into it. So Vlad fought a different kind of war. He emptied every village in the army's path. He poisoned the wells. He burned the crops and drove off the livestock. The vast Ottoman host moved through a hot, silent land. They gave it nothing to eat and no one to fight. Then, on a night in June 1462, Vlad did something close to suicide. He gathered a force of his own men, rode in darkness into the heart of the Ottoman camp, and went hunting for Mehmed's personal tent. His plan was to kill the Sultan in the middle of the Sultan's own army. The raid failed in its main goal. Vlad's men struck the wrong tents, and Mehmed survived the night. But a message had been delivered with perfect clarity. The prince of this small, poor country had been willing to walk straight into the center of an empire to cut down its emperor. Mehmed continued his advance toward the Wallachian capital, a town called Targoviste. He was now marching on an enemy he had every reason to take seriously. What he did not yet know was what Vlad had prepared for him on the open ground outside that city. When the Ottoman army reached the approaches to Targoviste, it stopped. Ahead of it, stretching across the ground, stood a forest that had not grown there. It was made of wooden stakes, and on the stakes were bodies. Ottoman bodies, prisoners and soldiers taken in the earlier fighting. The contemporary accounts put the number at around 2,000. That figure may well be inflated, because numbers from this period almost always are. But the army standing in front of it was not counting. It was only looking. The sources describe the reaction of Mehmed the Second himself. This was a man who had conquered Constantinople, who had spent his entire life around war and death. They describe him shaken. According to the account that comes down to us, the Sultan said he could not take the country of a man who could do such things. A man capable of this, he said, deserved to keep his land. And then the largest army in Europe turned around. Mehmed marched it out of Wallachia. It is worth being exact about what happened there, because it sits at the center of everything Vlad became. He did not defeat the Ottoman Empire. The empire was never defeated. It chose to withdraw. Vlad won by making himself a more expensive problem than he was worth. He raised the price of conquering him to a level even Mehmed the Second would not pay. The forest outside Targoviste was not the work of a madman. It was a weapon, aimed with terrible precision at the mind of a single man. And yet that same weapon could not save him. Terror works on an enemy, but it also works on allies, on neighbors, on every person who hears the story secondhand. The reputation that had turned an empire around had also, slowly, made Vlad a man that no one in Europe wanted to be seen standing beside. Within months of Mehmed's retreat, Vlad's position collapsed. His own brother Radu, raised in that same Ottoman court, was offered the Wallachian throne with Ottoman backing, and the exhausted nobility accepted him. The king of Hungary, who was supposed to be Vlad's ally, arrested him instead of helping him and held him as a prisoner for many years. The man who had frightened a sultan was brought down by an ordinary truth. Frightened people do not make loyal friends. While Vlad sat in a Hungarian prison, something was happening to his name that he had no power to stop. The printing press had recently arrived in Europe. Among the first popular things it produced were cheap pamphlets, sold to ordinary readers. And some of the best-selling pamphlets in the German-speaking lands were lurid accounts of the atrocities of Vlad the Impaler. They described impalements, mutilations, a prince calmly eating his meals among the dying. Some of it was true, some of it was exaggerated, and some of it was simply invented by Saxon merchants who had their own old grudges against him. This is the first hidden truth about Vlad the Third. The image of the inhuman monster was not just recorded by history, it was manufactured, printed, sold, and carried across Europe by one of the very first forms of mass media. Very often, by people with a clear motive to make him look as terrible as possible. The real Vlad was genuinely brutal. But the legend that finally reached the world was that brutality with the volume deliberately turned up. Vlad was eventually released from his Hungarian prison. In 1476, he fought his way back toward the Wallachian throne one last time. The campaign was short. Late that year, or early in the next, he was killed in battle against the Ottomans. The reports say his head was cut from his body and carried to the Ottoman capital, where it was put on display. A final proof, for the empire that had once retreated from his forest, that the prince was finally gone. He should have faded into the same quiet obscurity as 100 other violent medieval princes. He did not. 400 years later, in 1897, an Irish novelist named Bram Stoker was searching for a name and a setting for a horror story. He found the word Dracula. He found the dark mountains of Transylvania, and he fixed both onto a creature entirely of his own imagination, an undead nobleman who drinks the blood of the living. Stoker's vampire has almost nothing to do with the real prince. It borrowed his name, and it left everything else behind. And so the real man was buried twice. Once in the ground, sometime around 1476, and once again beneath a fiction so successful that it quietly replaced him. We still do this. We take a real and complicated person, keep only the single most sensational thing about them, and let that one thing stand in for the whole life. Vlad simply suffered it more completely than almost anyone. First at the hands of the pamphlet printers, then at the hands of a novelist, until the costume was the only part anyone remembered. The truth underneath the costume is not supernatural, and it is not comfortable. Vlad the Third was a ruler shaped by a childhood spent as a hostage. He governed a violent country with even greater violence. And he once frightened the most powerful empire of his age into turning around and going home. He was not a monster out of a story. He was something history produces far more often than it likes to admit. A real man who learned, early and completely, that fear works. The vampire is the version we can hear and still sleep afterward. The prince is the one who actually lived.